Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. Today's video, we're going to ask why fashion is so bad when it comes to talking about sustainability and why that's a major issue. So this is kind of part of a little series I'm doing here on my channel, which is understanding fashion's biggest issues. And I did a video recently about supply chains and why they're a massive headache towards progress in sustainability. So check that out as well if you're interested. I also spoke about this subject briefly on my Substack, which is free to subscribe to if you want to do that. But let's get into it. I think, as I said with the supply chain video, there is an underlying reason for all of these issues in fashion right now, which is that the industry is trying to protect a broken system and make it work versus recreating the system, redesigning it in a way that inherently works for sustainability. I think the main issue when it comes to sustainable fashion communication is the fact that fashion has always been an elitist industry, and it made sense that when sustainable fashion came along, it was no different. But this shouldn't be the case. So what do I mean when I say sustainable fashion feels elitist? Language is such an important part of understanding something and accepting it into your daily life. But we're doing a terrible job of making sustainable fashion accessible and easy to understand. It feels like you almost need a glossary or an index for sustainable fashion terms these days. And in fact, some major publications have come out with them because there's so much nuance in the conversation. And I know that has to happen. We have to have different areas of study, but all of these acronyms and buzzwords feel like they're clogging up discourse rather than helping it. One example I wanted to share was Elon Musk's now infamous letter to Tesla employees titled "Acronyms Seriously Suck" or something like that. He spoke about how using jargon or acronyms causes a speed bump in understanding and prohibits learning about something as quickly. And whilst I didn't think I would be saying this, I think Elon Musk is right. Let's do a couple of examples before I lean into the issues a bit more. So Condé Nast has a sustainable fashion glossary that's actually a really good resource and something you should check out if you're interested. But I wanted to go through and see what kind of terms are on here and whether a normal person would be able to guess them without being a sustainable fashion geek or, part of the industry. I think some jargon and keywords have made it into the wider discourse now. So BCI, Better Cotton Initiative, is quite well known, thanks in part to the recent scandal there. But would you know what LCA is if a brand talked about it in their advertising? Probably not. Life cycle assessment is what we call LCA, and it talks about measuring the impact of a garment from farm to the end of its life and, beyond. It's pretty easy to understand when you break it down like that, but if you were to just see the acronym LCA without any other context, you might feel a bit confused and turned off by the whole thing. I think it's the same thing for words that have become even more popular to use, like greenwashing. I had someone ask the other day what it means, and whilst a lot of us might already know, it's a made-up word. Greenwashing is not a thing, and it's not that easy to guess from context. If you don't know it, then you might feel left out of the whole conversation. This is part of what I mean when I say language is so important. When you take away the context of something or rely on someone else's previous knowledge to understand, then you create a barrier to communication. I'm not saying that brands need to be talking in the easiest language possible. People aren't stupid and they can understand complex ideas and complex systems. But when you use really technical language or when you make language more complex than it needs to be, then it creates a barrier to accessibility, and it also makes people believe that something is more complex than it is. And I think that's what brands want, and we'll get into that. Let's talk about some more examples, like greenwashing. Often greenwashing is talked about in relation to specific buzzwords like eco or green. Brands were using these key terms as a way of quickly identifying to consumers which products were sustainable in some way, even if they weren't. But according to Claire Press, who's a well-known sustainability expert in the space, there is no snappy way of advertising a product's sustainability, especially relative to every other product on the market. There's so many factors we need to take into account when we're talking about whether something is sustainable or not, like the materials used, how the product impacts the local community, animal rights, and the relative importance of all of these factors to the person buying it, since sustainability sometimes can be subjective. There's never going to be one word that can sum all of this up. It needs context. Sustainability can't be a word that encompasses all of this nuance. But we also can't ask people to be a walking dictionary. And I don't really have a solution to this, but I do think it is an issue. I think we can prove this point by looking at Courtney's sustainability role at Boohoo. If her role at a fast fashion company and the work being done by some small handmade brands can use the same word sustainable to describe themselves, then something has to be wrong. Another example here is the jargon used by the industry, especially in B2B headlines and media. The language used there has gotten so complex, it can be really overwhelming. I get really confused when I see any kind of acronyms used in brand messaging or on articles. My brain still shuts down whenever I see a complex acronym that I have to, struggle to put context into. And I think this is probably true for a lot of people in the industry. Why should you have to memorize and work hard to remember acronyms that someone's made up? Surely sustainability should not be this complex. Another example of why this is an issue is that it leads to a lack of context and a lack of understanding. And this is where a lot of controversies in sustainable fashion start. For example, a lot of influencers like myself like to talk about overconsumption and how that's harming the environment. And because this is often something facing consumers, and we're talking about how consumers can cut their consumption, it can be a touchy point. And I think the reason for this is because we're talking about one thing, but the context of the word is lost in translation. So when we're talking about overconsumption, we're not talking about people who are, buying one or two things a month, even from Shein or Temu. We're talking about people that are doing £500 hauls every day, putting it on social media, showing that excessive shopping and making it normalized. But you wouldn't know that if I was just to say the word overconsumption. I think there's even deeper nuance to this. Like someone I follow on TikTok the other day was talking about how handmade isn't really the right word to describe a garment made from a slow fashion brand with one or two sewers versus a factory of people working for a big brand. Really, we're talking about independently made, because all clothing is handmade, whether it's made by someone in a sweatshop or whether it's made by someone in a little studio. Another example is the term fast fashion. Now, I saw a UAL professor talk about this here and say that fast fashion doesn't really convey the depth of meaning when we talk about the polyester clothing that is churned out by brands every day. We should really be calling it forever fashion, since it's going to last for a really, really, really long time. And to call it fast fashion loses some of that depth of meaning. It makes us think that it's something that's going to be over and done with really quickly. But it's not. It's going to have impact for years. Another example is calling people consumers, making their primary role tied to their purchasing power. And I'm so guilty of this, but I don't have another term that I've found that encompasses the person I'm talking about in the role of the sustainable fashion sphere. I would love to start a discussion about what we could call people other than consumers, because I think it's something that I definitely need to change on this channel. Okay, I think I've given enough examples. Let's talk in broader terms about why this is an issue. I think our current method of talking about sustainable fashion is inhibiting the growth of sustainability. It's pushing the idea that sustainable fashion is elitist, that you have to know all of these key terms to understand what brands are trying to tell you. And that just isn't true. It's almost like they're saying it's something you have to work at versus something that's inherent. Sustainability is inherent, it's natural, but then capitalism came along and convinced us that fashion is something we need to have and we need to always be consuming. And I think that's what brands want. If they can convince us sustainability is complex enough and requires enough understanding of all these different key terms, then we might believe that and we might ask less of them. We might think they have to, be across all of these different sectors and all of these different coalitions and, think about life cycle assessments. And while this is true, really, the most sustainable thing they could do is cut their production. Cutting the amount of clothing they produce would significantly improve everything. But this is not something they want to do because capitalism. So they're doing their best to make a broken system work versus create a whole new one around the idea that we don't need so much. I think all this complexity causes confusion and resentment towards the movement of sustainable fashion. And obviously that's a problem. So we need to be improving things. We need to be making it way more accessible. That's what I try to do on this channel. And I think someone else who does this really, really well is Venetia Lamana. You've probably seen one of her videos talking about a brand and their greenwashing ways, for example. And the way she conveys all of this information that, could technically be boring or, could be more complex than it is really interesting to me. She makes it so accessible. And I find watching her videos so easy. They're little snack-sized 1-minute videos that convey everything you need to know in them, which perfectly works for our generation. I think this is something I want to work towards continuously with my channel, and something that I want to be known for, I guess, is making sustainable fashion accessible, making it understandable to the masses. I have a few ideas about how I want to do this. I want to be, breaking news more than I want to be reporting it. So that's something that I'm working towards with my next phase of videos, which I'm really excited to show you guys. But yeah, I'd love to know what your thoughts are on this, whether you agree, whether you have any ideas about how the fashion industry could improve, or any examples you have of when you've been confused by a brand and their sustainability messaging. So let me know in the comments. And have a lovely day, and I'll speak to you really soon. Bye.